At the bottom of page 107, we have another big name for French post-impressionism, Paul Gauguin. Figure 1618, Paul Gauguin's Hail Mary. Well, it's a depiction of the Madonna and Child. It's a fairly common scene. We've actually seen it once before in the course with Caravaggio's Madonna of Loreto, figure 13:3 in your textbook. Two pilgrims come to worship baby Jesus. Because sometimes when the paintings are reduced in size to fit into the textbook or the screen or whatever, sometimes things get hard to see. There's a angel back here. Let me get my little pin thing that I don't really like all that much. There's an angel back here, almost hidden in the bush. Some people have trouble seeing the angel back there. Not a big deal. Well, we've seen several depictions of Mary and baby Jesus in the course so far, but nothing quite like this. Mary and baby Jesus being depicted as people from the South Pacific, from Polynesia. What's going on with Gauguin's Hail Mary? Well, to understand that, we need to back out of painting for a little while and take a look at some philosophy. Gauguin is heavily influenced by a philosophical movement called Primitivism. Primitivism is one of the social and political philosophies that comes out of the Enlightenment. When we talked about the Enlightenment several sessions ago, I told you that a starting point for a sophisticated conversation about politics or social issues is with the political and social theories that come out of the Enlightenment, and Primitivism is one of them. The first philosopher to really articulate a theory of Primitivism is a philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, a very influential thinker. If you go on and take courses in education, you'll be reading an awful lot of Rousseau's work. I would hope you would be anyway. Just about everything we think about when we think about school life comes out of Rousseau's work. The idea of studying a little bit of every subject every day of the week, the idea of recess, physical education, all kinds of ideas about education come out of Rousseau's work. And he's one of the first to articulate a philosophy of primitivism. Primitivism argues two different things. First of all, Rousseau argues that all the way back in the first day of class time, all the way back in the prehistoric period, all the way back in the Neolithic period, Paleolithic period for that matter, people lived in what Rousseau called a state of nature. This means that people just lived. They lived their lives the way they wanted to live their lives, and nobody told anybody what to do. There's no police officers, no court system, no kings, no queens, no legislatures, no teachers, no preachers, no Dr. Phil types. Nobody tells anybody what to do. Instead, everybody just lives the way they want to live. Living in what Rousseau calls a state of nature. Now, this part of primitivism is not terribly controversial, and in fact, this is pretty much the starting point for most of the political philosophies that come out of the Enlightenment. The way the Enlightenment thinkers thought about things was that you understood something by understanding where it came from. You understood the origin of it, then you would understand the thing itself. And so the starting point for most political thinkers in the Enlightenment was to try to imagine a world where there is no government, and then try to see how government evolved, try to see where political structures come from. So this part isn't terribly controversial. What Rousseau says next is terribly controversial because Rousseau says that's the way people should live today. That's the way people were designed by their creator to live. That's how Rousseau would put it. That people are designed to live in a world where there's no political structure, no government, no class system, no manners, no morals, where everybody just does whatever they want to do, living in a state of nature. I like to think of primitivism as the natural philosophy of 14-year-olds. If it weren't for all these people telling me what to do, my life would be a whole lot better off. Maybe some of you can identify with that. Well, Rousseau's a bit more sophisticated than that, but not all that much. I mean, Rousseau really does believe that society is the root of problems, that everybody's problems, whether we're talking about social problems like poverty or whatever, or individual problems like mental depression, are all caused by social expectations, expected behaviors, manners, rules, morals, the laws. The people, in fact, Rousseau says, everywhere man is free, but everywhere man is born in chains. And those chains are all the rules and the manners and morals and all the expectations of behavior. that Rousseau says people need to be liberated from, because society is to blame for people's problems. Well, Gauguin, the artist here for figure 1618, is heavily influenced by Rousseau's work, heavily influenced by primitivism, so much so that he becomes convinced that Western culture has become so bogged down with rules and expected behaviors and good manners and all these kinds of things that he literally turns his back on his own culture. He leaves Europe altogether and moves to the South Pacific, to a string of islands called Polynesia and to the island of Tahiti in particular, where he believes that he's discovered people who live closer to that state of nature, where he's discovered people who are a primitive people. And if you understand primitivism, that phrase, primitive people, sounds odd to our politically correct ears, but if you understand that word primitive, and if you understand primitivism, then you see that it's meant to be a compliment, because these are people who've not gotten bogged down with a bunch of rules and laws and morals and all those kinds of things. Now, whether in fact the Polynesian people were closer to the state of nature, well, that's something you would argue about in an anthropology class. It's certainly possible that Gauguin, as an outsider, doesn't see all these rules and all these laws, but we're just looking at what Gauguin says anyway. So Gauguin leaves Europe and goes to where he believes, at least, people have the ability to live closer to that state of nature. Now, coming back to Gauguin's Hail Mary, we see we can start to make sense out of the painting here. I'd suggest to you this is another use of iconography. I talked about iconography with you when we talked about Goya's 3rd of May, 1808. The use of a religious symbol in a secular context so that the meaning of the symbol is transferred to the new context. Well, the Madonna and Child, obviously a symbol that comes out of Christianity, but you don't have to be a Christian to recognize the symbol and understand what it means in a Christian context. The Madonna and Child is an expression of hope. There's hope for the future. The Christ child has been born, the Anointed One, the Messiah, and now there's hope for the future. And by portraying Mary and baby Jesus as Polynesian people, for Gauguin, what's the hope for the future for Western culture? But to get back to a state of nature, to get away from all the rules and all the laws and get back to a state of nature. Rejecting everything that's come before in the course before is as a part of this response to this cultural crisis that Western culture is heading into. I'll be making more about that at a later point, but coming to despise one's own culture, rejecting one's own culture becomes a part of the experience here. I've got another example of Gauguin's work for you on page 108 in your textbooks. Figure 1620 on page 108. Whence, what, whither. In other words, where did we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Whence, what, whither. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the painting, but a famous example of Gauguin's work, you actually read the painting from right to left. Over here, you have the birth of a baby. Over here, you have an older woman. And it's the process of life kind of arching this way. In the background, you have another use of iconography, a vague symbol that Gauguin simply calls an idol of the beyond. In other words, the call to something beyond this physical world, which is symbolized by the blue idol back there. Not going to spend much time unraveling the painting, but another famous work by Gauguin. If you're interested, you can find your ways to work your way through the allegory and the painting here. I've also got an example in your textbook of one of Gauguin's work from before he leaves Europe, and it's very typical of his work before leaving Europe, showing usually children at play with no adult there telling them what to do or setting out the rules for the game, but just children without adults telling them what to do. If you think back to primitivism, you get the point, the same idea, just having fun and doing what you want to do and nobody telling you what to do. Well, primitivism is a very influential movement. We're going to come across it several times in the course. Very influential on all kinds of areas in Western culture. A major influence on the hippie movement that we'll catch up to eventually in the course. Well, we're going to run into primitivism again. On the bottom of page 108, you have, there we go, several examples. In fact, on pages 108 and 109, you have several examples of the two types of work to associate with another name for post-impressionism. That's Paul Cézanne. At the bottom of page 108, you have 4 examples of Cézanne's still lifes. This one here you have figure 1624. You have so many, I'm trying to keep track of which ones you have. Still lifes are a type of painting that develops during the Renaissance. Artists would, that's just a way for artists to practice their brushstrokes and that kind of thing. Usually a domestic scene, usually a tabletop. The artist goes in the kitchen, grabs some stuff, puts it on a table, and then practices the painting. Eventually they became their own recognized type of painting. You can recognize Cézanne's still lives very quickly by noticing the repetition of the basic geometric shapes. Over and over again, you see the basic geometric shapes being repeated. For example, here you have the repetition of the circles in the peaches here, the circular bowls, the circular vases, the circular knobs on the dresser back there, all the different rectangles that go into the painting, quadrilaterals and rectangles, the repeated shapes. Here you have the repeated shapes. I'm not going to do all that stuff again, but the repeated shapes of the apples through here, the repeated cylindrical shapes of the Twinkies, or whatever those are back there, the circular basket, again all the different rectangles, the different circles of the apples here and the apple bowls and so on. Once you pick up on that and catch on to what I'm getting, then you learn to recognize Cézanne still lifes very, very quickly. The other type of work to associate with Cézanne you also have in your textbook on page 109, and that is Cézanne's landscapes. Figure 1625 in your textbook. You have Cézanne's Mount Saint-Victor, a good example of Cézanne's landscapes. With the help of me walking you through the painting, you can make out the scenes here, the mountain in the background back here, some farmers' fields back here, a village down in the valley down here. But as you see, there's no attempt at all to capture the detail of the village, but just the raw shapes and colors of the buildings and structures that make up the village, but no attempt to capture any detail there at all. With Cézanne's landscapes, he pushes that breaking things down into shapes and colors thing about as far as you can push it until the scene becomes almost unintelligible. It's hard to see what the scene even is. In your textbook, you also have Cézanne's The Forest on page 109, figure 1627. You see the trees and so on, but the shapes and colors have almost obliterated the scene. You have on the screen, not in your textbook, but you have another painting by Cézanne, Bend in the Road. You have the roadway here wrapping around the hillside, the trees on the opposing hillside, the tree alongside the road. But Cézanne has pushed that breaking things down into shapes and colors thing about as far as you can push it. And after Cézanne, that tendency tends to fall away because Cézanne's already pushed it about as far as it can be pushed. Well, once my computer wakes up, that's going to finish us up for Cézanne. We're going to move on to the last Post-Impressionists we'll be talking about.